Several months ago, when I decided only partly in this coming year to do some of the lectionary passages, I had the freedom to choose some other passages, and one of the combinations of books that are not in the lectionary, and therefore I had never preached before. I had only done in Sunday school. And there's a greater freedom in Sunday school because you have more time and you can really focus in. You don't have to necessarily have a deadline to finish every section of the study. So doing a study of Ezra and Nehemiah gives you great freedom. I've also done it in my breakfast Bible studies. In fact, 2 years ago, did it in the last breakfast Bible study that has continued. It became a Zoom Bible study when the restaurant closed during COVID, and we continue on Zoom every Tuesday morning now. And 2 years ago, we did Ezra and Nehemiah. It took us months to get through Ezra and Nehemiah because we had the opportunity to ask questions as we went along. So I was confronted with fitting Ezra and Nehemiah into this space after Epiphany leading up to the first week of Lent. I had a set number of weeks, and I had 2 books. And so as I studied them and tried to put together the text that we would take a look at, I had to kind of picture how we would frame this together. And some of you are thinking, we're still trying to figure out how this all fits in. If it's any comfort, so were they. The people who were living this. Boy, we think our lives were disrupted this morning. How would you, after 70 years, like to have the challenge of traveling back to a fallen Jerusalem? Completely building a home and starting to rebuild the temple, because the whole purpose of going back was to worship the Lord on the holy site of the temple in the land of promise. And we celebrate this morning because they're going to finish the temple. Last week we saw that after 16 years, most of which time the building of the temple had been suspended because of the opposition from the people in this Transjordan area that had been known as Samaria. So eventually, those people who now were in that land and surrounded the holy city came to be called Samaritans. We don't see that name used in Ezra and Nehemiah, but that's who they were. They were the half-breeds who the Assyrians, when they conquered the northern kingdom, had brought into that land, along with people from cultures all over the place who they had conquered, and then they shipped the northern kingdom Israelites out, the 10 tribes. They all became mixed in with people throughout the known world of the Assyrian Empire. The only ones who remained purebred after they were conquered were the Judahites and the Benjamites. And for 70 years, they lived in Babylonia, who were conquered by the Persians. Are you totally confused now? Because as I divided up these summary chapters of these 2 books, and we are going to get to Nehemiah next week, which is really part of the whole narrative, I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to explain this to everyone? And then as I sat down to work on today, I couldn't fit the text on one page. I've got 2 pages of scripture readings, the second page of which are fairly brief. And some of you are thinking, oh my, he's just going to keep going right up until it's time for kickoff for the Super Bowl. Well, I've got 6 or 7 hours, don't I? Not going to do it. But I am going to ask you to be patient with me. I might even ask you some questions along the way, and hopefully you'll be patient with yourselves as we go through this. And I hope you're reaching back and thinking, where are we now? You'll recall last week that they began renewed work on the temple. After 16 years of being there, they began the renewed work. Well, Jim's here this morning. He was the project manager on the refurbishing of the old temple up on the hill. He had strategic helpers here or there. I wish Dave was here this morning because I was just absolutely fascinated when I went in at one point and saw the wall of what is now the laundry room. And I think it was Jim who told me when I looked at that wall, he said, Dave did that. I think he did several places like that. And of course, we were there last week and we walked all through it, and some of you were going back to your childhood and you were a little jealous of these guys. Of course, Noah's the baby now, but he's old. He's in high school. And Michaela is a college kid. But some of you were picturing being even younger than that and sneaking down back stairs into the kitchen. And on Christmas Eve, having all kinds of ways after you were put in bed to find a route that would get you down to wherever the Christmas tree and the gifts were, and getting back to your bedroom with no one realizing that you had pulled this off, because there are so many little crooks and crannies and back steps and front steps. Of course, they all creak. Well, it wasn't quite so romantic when they were doing that revision, that restoration. Some of those days were downright arduous and hot and dusty. And the same was true for the rebuilding of this temple. I mean, they arrived in Jerusalem and it's nothing but rubble. How many of you are still seeing pictures on the news of Los Angeles where the fires were? And in a couple of years, we're going to be seeing pictures of beautiful homes. Just in a few years. Whole new neighborhoods that are just going to be absolutely beautiful. You're going to help pay for them. But it wasn't nearly so quick in ancient times. The city lay in ruins for 70 years. And if you want to get a feel for how devastated the city was, and we studied it a couple years ago in Lamentations, what the city looked like. I mean, at the point that the Lamentations of Jeremiah were being written, I mean, he's talking about bodies still decaying in the streets, along with the rubble of all the buildings that were burned and taken down. It's just a wasteland. It was Pacific Palisades. And the temple, which was and is on holy ground, was just rubble. And so they're sent, they're invited. No one was forced, they were invited to go back to their homeland for the specific purpose of building the holy temple again in Jerusalem. And 42,000 of them chose to accept that invitation. Amongst whom were some folks who were young, and by young, probably anywhere from 5 or 6 to 12 or 13, in some cases probably. They're now 70 years older. And they made the trip, the 4-month trip, from Babylon back to Jerusalem. They have no homes. They have to build their homes in addition to the focus for which they have been commanded to go by the king of the empire to build the holy temple of Yahweh again, so that worship can take place. So in the midst of the wasteland, with crumbled walls and boulders all over the place, wreckage, they find the Temple Mount, they clear it, they lay the foundation. And you'll recall, because it's going to happen again, most of them cheered. But amongst the cheers was the sound of wailing, because those ones who were young when they left were now older, and they looked at the foundation of the temple and they're thinking, it's not going to be as grand as the temple that was destroyed, the Temple of Solomon. But they took a deep breath, and over a period of years, they finally get to the point where we read in Ezra 6, beginning with verse 13. Then, because of the decree of King Darius, Tatnai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. This was the last push in those last 4 years. The elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, 3 kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. That would be March 12th, 516 BC. Anyone here born on March 12th? It doesn't ring a bell with anyone, huh? Anyone here born in March? Oh, there you go. We have some March birthdays. This happened in the month of March in 516 BC. Everyone was looking forward to your birth as well. And then the people of Israel held 2 celebrations, and you'll see this in your sermon outlines. At this point, they're going to have 2 celebrations in successive months. The first was the dedication of the temple. Now, it's very interesting. As you'll see in your sermon outline, I might even be able to find my sermon outline. In 1 Kings chapter 8, we get a description of the dedication of the first temple of Solomon. It was a grand affair. Of course, at that time, Jerusalem was a well-established city. And all of the tribes came together at Jerusalem for this grand temple that was built under the administration of Solomon. It was a moment. And of course, at that point, Israel had become famous. It was a major power. And here they had the temple of their God. You'll remember that David wasn't permitted by God to build a temple. Do you remember what God said to him about that? God spoke to David. David was feeling guilty because he had already built a palace for himself. And basically he said to God, here I am in a palace, and you're residing in a tent. I want to build a grand home for you, a temple that's appropriate for you. And God says to David, I don't want you to build a temple for me. There's two reasons for this, one of which is God was a mobile God. He still is. Charlie and I were at a meeting with pastors from all over Delaware County this week, and I eavesdropped on some of Charlie's conversations. It's kind of funny because I've been going to meetings like this for years, and for the first time, they treated me like I was old. And I realized what was happening when the big fella who was sitting next to me at my table, as everybody was getting up to kind of mix together after we had a prayer time together, and he led in the closing prayer. And then he turned to me and he said, I am so glad you are here, brother. I'm thinking, why me? Well, as he continued to talk, I realized what he was saying is, it's good for all of us young people here to have an old guy in our midst. He didn't say that, but he said it. And I wasn't offended. I felt privileged. And I contemplated all those times we read in the scriptures about God raising up another generation of servants to serve his people. And I looked around that room over at Valley Point Church, and there were all of these people who God had raised up, who frighteningly, when I started, hadn't even been born yet. And oh my, what a richness of stories there would be. And I hear Charlie talking to another guy about Garnet Valley High School. The other guy was a former youth minister at Concord Liberty Church. And they're trying to share strategies and secrets on how to be able to hang around the high school. And the one guy's saying to the other guy, I used to go over at lunchtime. They let me come in and sit at lunch. Don't let you do that anymore. It's like a fortress now. For good reason. You ought to try to get into a middle school basketball game after school. You got to park in the back. They have the actual parking lot blocked off because that's only for staff and buses. And you have to park up on the grass and walk across the mud and the snow to get to the back entrance of the school. And then you kind of stand at the door until you see someone inside walk by, and you wave and shout and say, let me in, because the doors are locked. Unless I go with my wife, who occasionally will go with me to one of the games, and she's got the secret card, the transponder card for staff, and we actually get to go in the front door. She just holds that baby up, and the door clicks, and we walk in. And I'm thinking, keep my feet dry today. And here are the Israelites coming back after all of those years, And there have been changes in leadership. And they're beginning the work. God raises up a whole new generation. So they celebrate. And some of them had learned the scriptures. Most of them had not. They don't know about the record of the first dedication, but it was a grand event. Do you all remember what happened as they dedicated the Temple of Solomon? Do you remember what occurred? What occurred at the tabernacle when they first created the tabernacle according to God's specifications? What happened when they worshiped in the tabernacle the first time? Do you all recall? Does anyone recall? You're allowed to answer. The presence of the Lord in what form? The cloud of smoke or mist or whatever. It looked like smoke. And at night it would become fire. Well, as they got ready to bring their sacrifices to the tabernacle, the cloud, which was referred to as the Shekinah glory, began to move toward the tabernacle. The presence of the Lord. It descended on the tabernacle and filled it, so that at first they couldn't even go in. And every time they would gather to worship at the tabernacle, the Shekinah glory would come upon it. Well, here they were, years later, and under Solomon, they build this temple, and it's the day of dedication. And as they're standing in the courtyard of the temple, going through the liturgy of dedicating the temple to the holy God, they look out and they see a cloud moving toward Jerusalem. And doesn't it descend right on the Temple of Solomon and fill that temple? Can you imagine if that happened to us this morning? Now, I will confess to you, and I am a little bit fanciful, I know that. I often picture that when I come here this morning. My biggest challenge this morning was getting in, because the doors were locked and the transponder wasn't working. And I pounded on the door. I actually was in. I went out, and I came back in. And when I tried to come back in, I couldn't get in. The door's locked. I was getting ready to walk down to see if Judy, because I knew she was in there, I wanted to see if she was in the library yet. I was going to pound on the window and get Judy. And as I started to walk to go down that way, Jim had come out, and he saw me, and he let me in. Reminded me of that old song, "Let Me In, Ooh." Remember that one? Some of you do. Nancy's laughing. She remembers that. She's ready to get up and dance. Can you imagine the Shekinah glory coming upon this place? Well, it has. In us. Christ in us. Oh my, would they have loved that back in this time? So here they are. There's no Shekinah glory at this point. But they are going to dedicate the temple for the service of God in Jerusalem, it tells us in verse 18. And they install the Levites and the priests. Everything is great. And one thing, even though it's not as grand as it was back in Solomon's time, they celebrate with joy. How many of you were here for the dedication of this building? Many of you were. And I'll bet you worshiped with joy. Many of you were here for the dedication of the barn. Doesn't seem such a big deal now, does it? I preached in that barn. I was a guest preacher one morning at the barn. I still remember the children's sermon that I gave as a part of my duties as the guest preacher there. I brought my old baseball glove and told a little story about it. It was a grand time of worship in that little sanctuary within the barn. It was a neat place. And this has become another place. All of these memories are happening as they dedicate the temple that they have built with their own hands, and they celebrate it with joy. And then the 14th day of the first month came up, and they had another celebration. It was the Passover celebration. And of course, the Passover was the great feast day of the people of God. And it lasts 7 days. And so they celebrate it with all the gusto that they had. And we think, well, we can just end the book of Ezra right here at chapter 6. Everyone lives happily ever after. Well, no. Because the enemies are still there. They're regrouping. They hear them celebrating. And all around them is rubble. They have built the temple, but the walls are demolished. No one lives in the city. The Levites and the priests can come up for the major feast days at the temple, but then they go back to their land and they struggle to survive in their land. The temple is not a bustling place every day of the week. There's hardly anyone there, and no one lives in the city. And there is the impending thought that any day now, if someone gets a mind to do it, they could destroy this temple because we have no way to protect it or to protect ourselves. No one lives here. We just have our temple. Think about that for a while, and it gets a little scary. It's like being the pastor of the church and not being able to get in the door. I kept pounding. I even went over to the kitchen door thinking maybe someone's back in the kitchen. I pounded the kitchen door. Nothing. Jim came sauntering out and saw the non-sun gleaming off the top of my head and decided to rescue me. Well, we come to the rest of today's text, which is Ezra 7, which seems like it would move just from one place to another. Well, it's many, many years later, 60 years later. How many of you remember what your life circumstances were 60 years ago? Charlie wasn't even born yet. Judy remembers. Where were you 60 years ago? That's a pretty good increment of time. Well, the biblical passage, from Ezra 6 to Ezra 7, 60 years passes just like that. You've got to go to extra biblical sources to even realize how many years pass. It says there's a copy of a letter that King Artaxerxes had given to Ezra, a priest, a teacher of the law, a man learned in matters concerning the community or the commands and decrees of the Lord of Israel. And we see the proclamation. Basically, he's going to send this priest 60 years later to go to Israel to establish the law of God at the temple in Israel. He's not going to be the high priest. He's going to be like a professor priest. He's an expert in the law. He is also trained, as priests often were at that time, in the secular law. He's an agent of the state. And he is going to be sent with 7 major leaders that will be commissioned by the king to go with him to Israel. He's going to be the new sheriff in town, and he's going to be the new pastor in town. He's going to be both. That's why he's being sent. And you'll see in your sermon notes that there were two major goals for Persian kings at this time. You're running an empire. This is part of your empire and a key geographical part of the empire. Israel, as it is today, was then a major place in the empire. It's by the Mediterranean Sea. It's on all the major trade routes. They need to have stability here. He's sending Ezra to help establish that. Number one, they didn't want the gods to be angry with them. So the first major goal of the king was to make sure the God of Israel, and you got to remember, he's a polytheistic king. He's not against the God of Israel. He doesn't even know much about the God of Israel, but he knows that he has a history of being a powerful God. He doesn't want him angry at him. So he sends one of his guys, Ezra, the consummate priest, to go and establish the worship of God in Israel, so that God, Yahweh, that God, will be pleased. Of course, what he doesn't realize is that this Ezra would tell him that that God is the God, the only God. So Ezra will get into a troop of guys, 5,000 people. He's going to make the trip. Now, the original group that went was 42,000. This group under Ezra will just be 5,000. And they're going to make that long journey, probably the same route that the other guys went. This is many years later, even though as you read the book, if you don't have some extra sources to check the dates, you won't realize when it was happening. And he says, I decree that any of the Israelites in my kingdom, including priests and Levites, who volunteer to go, may go. You are sent by the king and his 7 advisors to inquire about Judah and Jerusalem. And so he takes off. And then he had another job to do. Establish the law of God, establish the law of the land. And when the king sends him, he sends him with real strength. Get this. Praise be to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who has put it into the king's heart to bring honor to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favor to me before the king and his advisors, all of the king's powerful officials. And because the hand of the Lord was on me, I took courage and gathered leaders from Israel to go up with me. The king has already commanded, whoever does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king must surely be punished by death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. So Ezra arrives in town, and you can all sing to yourselves the tune I sang to you last week. Wyatt Earp, brave, courageous, and bold. Because there's some music we're getting from a phone, and she even knows how to work it. She turned it off. She knows her password. Ezra enters Jerusalem with his 5,000-member entourage, and he, in a hurry, is going to reestablish the law of God. He sees a temple that is sitting there on the Temple Mount, as we refer to it today, on holy ground, and yet a city around it that is completely destroyed. And the other thing he finds out is that they have begun to intermarry and mingle with the people of the land. And Ezra, during the last part of the book of Ezra, is going to break up all of those marriages. It's a frightening thing to read when you picture what's happening. To reestablish the law of God, he begins to bring purity back to the people of Israel. And boy, he does it in a very direct way. As we're going to see, that is Ezra's style. But meanwhile, as he's establishing the law and creating these reforms, the city still lays in ruins. The door's still locked. Jim came by and saw me, but he couldn't get the door open. No, actually, he did get it open. Some of you may never get out. I hope you're ready to watch the Eagles game here today. And we don't have a TV, so we'll have to listen to it on radio. But we've got our colors on, some of us. Next week, and some of you are thinking, is it going to be over next week? No, it's going to be 2 more weeks. Next week, we're going to see a person who will be moved to come and to begin to restore the city, who will become a partner to Ezra in restoring the people of God. Some of you who worked on the farmhouse were up there at times working all alone. And probably sometimes as you looked around, I went up to visit one day and Jim was there, and there was another fellow there who he introduced me to. He was working on some special stuff. I mean, it was a big house, and there was an awful lot at that point that needed to be done. And I can get lonely. After many, many years after Ezra enters the city, he's reestablishing parts of the law, but the city is in shambles. And those who are sending messengers back to Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, and to where many Israelites were residing, they would ask about the holy city, and it wasn't good news. How's the farmhouse doing? You know, if you asked me at that point, I'd say, well, there's some good things happening. Jim's all excited about painting the kitchen, but, you go into other rooms and there's walls falling down. And you're trying to picture a family living in here, and you're thinking, well, gee, that's not going to be easy. And Charlie and his family are thinking, it wasn't easy just getting down the hill this morning on that ice just to get here to worship this morning. How'd you all do? Did anybody fall? Oh, you did. She's shaking her head. Laurie did her ice skate thing, and she got down the hill. It's interesting how God restores us and then develops us in the way that he goes ahead of us. We'll get a feel for that next week when we begin the book of Nehemiah. Now, I'm just looking at y'all. Have I totally bored you to death? Are you okay? Some of you are thinking, no, I love history. And others of you are thinking, I hate history. For those of you who hate history, my sympathies are with you. We're going to get a little bit more of it next week. And it's crucial for our understanding of what God has given us today. So come back next week. We won't lock you out, and we'll begin to complete this journey into the Holy Land. Let me close in prayer. Thank you, O Lord, that you are still in the act, in our text, of rescuing your people. And today, even in the midst of what we sometimes think are lives that we have figured out, you are still about the work of rescuing your people. In our communities, in our schools, in our churches, in all the places where people are who you hold dear, we pray that we would see each other with your eyes, and that we would understand all that you have done to bring us to this point. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.